you decided what you wanted to be when you grew up, and also how your work has really changed over the last few years. Because I remember when I first met you, you were sort of saying like, yeah, I work on a lot of appeals and mostly they don't go well. There's got to be a different way.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. And I definitely I view Brandon's arrival here in North Carolina as one of the turning points. I think stuff had already started to move in the direction it has gone for me and for NCPLS, but I definitely think that his use of data and his energy in this area have really galvanized people. So thank you. So I was originally in my life when I graduated from, I went to Williams College in Northwest Massachusetts and was a school teacher for 6 years, 4 years outside of Springfield, Massachusetts, and then a couple years in Rhode Island. And I didn't really like preparing for class, which is the thing you have to do if you're going to teach people. And so I went to law school at Iowa, and then my wife decided to go to Duke for nursing school. And so we moved here, and I was an education lawyer for a bit, which I didn't like, and I knew I didn't like, but the rent was due. And so I finally made my way to prisoner legal services. And then after about 4 years there, we had a group reach out to us and asked us if we could track juvenile life without parole cases in North Carolina. So the United States Supreme Court in 2012 held that states could not give life without parole as the mandatory, as the only option for a sentence to somebody who had committed a crime as a juvenile. And so people were, the group, the Vital Projects Fund that reached out to me was researching these cases nationally, and we're trying to find people in every state to gather the data. And so I was the person who did that for them in North Carolina. And that collaboration with the Vital Projects Fund turned into trying to find ways both to collect data on the general population of folks in prison in North Carolina and a way to get people out who had been in for a really long time, which at this point we basically think of as more than 20 years. So this group, you do what you do, which is that that Brandon and Will are familiar with. You make proposals, and Travis also. You make these proposals and you pitch it to the people who have millions of dollars, and then they give you a very, very small percentage of those millions of dollars so that you can try to help people. And so that's what, that's what we have done. And that's sort of the basic sketch. So looks like I'm probably able to share my screen. And so I'm going to go ahead and start doing that and then just give you my presentation here. If there are parts that I blitz through a little fast, A, forgive me, and B, feel free to say, hang on, slow down. All right. So this is the general topic of what I work on here, which is racialized mass incarceration in North Carolina. And so today we're going to focus specifically on, in addition to the general work, the impact that COVID has had on this. So, and let me just see if I can get yeah, there we go. So the first thing to know is that North Carolina Prisoner Legal Services, who my employer, is the final step in the chain of indigent defense. So people are, I think, generally familiar with the concept of public defenders. Not every county in North Carolina has a public defender's office, but in those areas, we have what are called private assigned counsel. Then after you've been convicted, if you are appealing your sentence, there is the state office of the appellate defender. And so that is the public defender version for appeals. So these are folks who you get their services for free. Then we are last. So we represent people whose convictions are final. They've already been convicted and either taken a guilty plea or they were convicted at trial and they had an appeal, and they are now in a North Carolina prison. So some of you may be aware that a man named Bernie Madoff is in Butner, North Carolina. We don't mess around with Bernie Madoff. He's in a federal prison and we'd have no time for him. Not sure we would have time for him anyway, but nevertheless, that's not what we get paid to do. So we, though it says North Carolina Prisoner Legal Services, we are not a state agency the way the public defender's offices are or the appellate defenders are. We are a 501c3. And so we just sign a contract with Indigent Defense Services, the blanket public defender organization, every 2 years to provide these legal services to prisoners, which is constitutionally required under the Eighth Amendment. You cannot lock people up and throw away the key. They have to have what is called access to the courts. So we do not lack for clients, despite not doing work in the federal system. As many of you probably know, we have a real incarceration problem here in the United States. 1 out of 5. That should say, I think, incarcerated people in the world are incarcerated in the United States. I'm not sure that prison, prisoners is not a term I like to use to refer to my clients, and B, there's a difference between prison and jail. Jail is where you go before you're convicted. Prison's where you go after you're convicted. And I think that number 2.3 million, which is a year or two old, accounts for jails as well. But the other thing is there are the numbers, the large scale numbers, and then there's also rates of incarceration. And with no offense to our, fellow peoples in El Salvador, Rwanda, and Russia, I don't think this is a list that you want to be on the top of. We incarcerate far more people per capita than not far more, but just more people than any other country per capita. And in addition, we have a real race problem when it comes to incarceration. The most startling one for me is, of course, the idea that 1 in 3 Black or African-American men will spend some time incarcerated in the United States. That is just bonkers. Across other communities of color, the numbers are not quite as bad, but are obviously worse than they are for white folks. So one of the reasons that we see some of these problems is that the number of people in prison took a real spike starting essentially in the mid 80s, but really then accelerating throughout the 90s. It has slowly started to decline, but just, I would also note, since this is a data focus group, ignore the placement of commas on the vertical axis here. That should be 1.6 million at the top, not 160 10,000s. But nevertheless, the shape of the graph tells you all you need to know. There was a real explosion, and some of what that was driven by is the number of people serving life sentences. This was the thing that when people talk about sort of, the explosion of sentencing in the 90s, this is the thing to which they are referring. The concept of life means life really took off in the 90s. We had to, I'm just going to say, suffer through 4 years of the Trump presidency, because Hillary Clinton once used the word super predators, which was a thing that people used to say in the mid 90s, and is not a good way to think about any human being, let alone some kids. But because that was sort of the prevailing theme at the time, we see a lot more life sentences being imposed. And I would note that what was being imposed then, particularly in North Carolina, was life without parole, which means that people they didn't even have a chance to get out, no matter what they did in prison. And that's why the numbers stay high, because fewer people get released. So the sort of sum of all these actions is that we have a system where we send massive numbers of people to prison. Most of them are people of color. They get longer sentences than ever before, and they don't get out at the rates that they used to get out. And what that leads us to is long-term incarceration of Black and African-American folks in North Carolina. Black and African-American folks are about 21% of the state population, but they make up 51.5% of the people who are in prison in North Carolina. They make up almost 56% of the people who would be my clients serving more than 20 years, 60% of the people serving life sentences or the equivalent, 73% of the kids who are sent to prison are Black or African-American. Almost all of those are boys. And if you want to look at sort of the eligible population, that's going to be 10.5% of the boys who could be sent to prison are going to be Black and African American, and 73% of the kids in prison, because they're almost all boys, are going to be Black and African American boys, and 81% of the kids who have ever been sentenced to die in prison were Black or African American, and almost again all of those males. This is just, to me, this is like I use this because I find it particularly horrifying how the worse the sentence gets, the more likely it's being handed out to a Black or African American person. With folks of color generally, in 1990, communities of color made up 25% of North Carolina. Now it's about 37%. But again, almost 60% of the prison population, almost 64% of long-term people, 66% of life sentences, 83% of the kids sent to prison, and a staggering 91.5% of all the kids who've ever been sentenced to die in prison are children of color. So this drives what I do in my professional life now. So again, this is what I run is called the Just Sentencing Project. So as Brandon noted, we use data and different kinds of litigation and advocacy just to try to get people out. We also do a lot of collaboration. Again, working with Brandon was one of the first things that I did after the project had been founded. We worked with UNC School of Law on something we call the Juvenile Parole Project, where we represent kids, people who were kids when they committed crimes who are now eligible for parole. So that brings us to the impact of COVID-19. And not surprisingly, as it is with almost any part of American society, Black and brown folks are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. This is not a current slide. This is from a little earlier in the pandemic, but I can't imagine that the numbers are significantly different. And of course, you just look across the board and any group of color is suffering worse than white folks are as a whole. So what we see here is that if prison populations are threatened by some event, then it's going to be folks of color who are threatened because they make up the majority of the folks in prison. And so one of the other issues that you see here is that, in any prison setting, there are folks being transferred in and out of the prison. You've got folks bringing in food. You've got folks who may come in and out to do maintenance and repairs, and the guards come in and out every day to work their shifts. So there's a lot of movement between and around prisons. And the risk is higher because people in prisons live, work, eat, study, and do everything sort of in these group environments. So, and the last point is really crucial because at least in my day-to-day life, I, as a general matter, stay far away from other people who are not in my pod because as the science has shown, social distancing and masking is the best way to avoid getting COVID. And in fact, because I don't ever see anybody anymore, I don't get COVID and haven't gotten COVID. But that's just simply not possible in prison. And yet, back in May, there was a guy who got transferred from Pender Correctional to Noose Correctional. I forgot the word "to" in there. So he had been promoted from medium to minimum custody. So that's good. You want to go into minimum custody. And what happened, though, was at the time he was transferred, this is a quotation from a News and Observer article. News had one of the highest one of the biggest COVID breakouts in the country. So why is a guy being transferred into a facility with one of the biggest breakouts that was happening anywhere in the country at the time? So a local attorney reached out to one of the lawyers for the Department of Public Safety who runs the prisons and said, "Hey, what's going on? This is my client. Why is he being transferred into a place with COVID? And this was the response. And I am quoting, and I'm allowed to quote from this email because this has been filed in a court case and is now a matter of public record. The department is not in a position to prevent it from fully utilizing available space at operational facilities. So that's crazy in my estimation that you would say we're going to transfer this guy in because we have to use the space we have. So the question is, what should the prison system have done? Because you know, I mean, they do need all the space that they can get, right? I mean, there's, you know, if you're going to do social distance, you can't do social distancing in my dining room. I tried at the beginning of the pandemic. My children were all home. My wife and I worked at the dining room table. The children worked at the dining room table. I don't recommend it to any of you if you can avoid that scenario. But the problem here is that DPS cannot control the spread of the virus. Once the virus gets into a prison, it's really, really difficult because, again, everybody's living and interacting with each other in close proximity all the time. So at the time, there were about 32,000 people in custody. And they obviously, you know, they needed to make some changes. Despite that quotation, they needed to make some changes to the way they operate their facilities. But the question was, what kind of changes and would they be enough? So basically what we have seen is that the only thing that's going to protect people is vaccination, which of course, at the time this email was sent in May, vaccines were not on the horizon. This was not an option at all. Or some kind of relatively massive decarceration campaign. People need to get out of prison because there's simply not enough space in a prison facility for folks to coexist with each other and with COVID-19. I mean, we're talking about a situation where people are, you know, people sleep in bunks that are set up 3 feet apart from each other, which, as you may realize, is less than the 6 feet that is recommended by the CDC for social distancing. And that's where they sleep. So there's no like alternative. There's no place to get out of the way if you're sleeping 3 feet from another guy. And by the way, they're bunk beds. So it's really like 4 guys in this tiny space. And if one of those guys brings COVID to bed, you're all getting COVID. So what we have done during the pandemic is to try to attack this from any number of different angles. So we have filed a number of what are called MARs. That stands for Motions for Appropriate Relief, which is the principal sort of legal maneuver that those of us who work at NCPLS employ to try to get both people out of prison or just to reduce their sentences. And I'll talk a little bit about our work in Durham and then essentially everywhere else. We also did a lot of data work, again, as Brandon mentioned, looking at transfers, and then this program called Extended Limits of Confinement, and just trying to provide data both to the Department of Public Safety about what was going on in their prisons and to people litigating to try to get DPS to change things. And then clemency, we have done work in trying to get the governor to take action. The governor can do basically whatever he wants with clemency and parole work. So a little bit about the importance of data. Everything we do, as Brandon mentioned, at the Just Sentencing Project is informed by data. I don't want to be flying blind. I don't want to be making claims that sort of don't hold up to scrutiny. So this is there, and there are 2 ways I think about this. There are obviously broad pieces of data about the system that I want to investigate. You know, again, how many of the children sentenced to die in prison are people of color? 91.5%. That's a broad piece of data about the way the system is operating that I think is both horrifying and important. But there's also data about our clients themselves. And so one of the other way that we think about this is at the time the person was sentenced and sent to prison, did the judge have data about our client that we think is important now? So, for example, was our client abused as a child? Would our client go in and out of the foster home system? Was our client addicted to drugs? Any number of pieces of data about the person's situation that were not apparent to the judge or may not have been apparent to the judge are important to us now. So the first data point we investigate is who's in prison, and then we try to figure out how we're going to get them out. So DPS makes publicly available tons of data. I remember the first time I showed this to Brandon, I was like, I am going to blow this guy's mind. And I don't know if I succeeded because it's hard to blow Brandon's mind, but it wasn't nothing. I'm fairly certain of that. So this is the website. Let's say, yes, my computer did cooperate. Perfect. So this is the site. If you do like a Google search for North Carolina public offender information, it might take you, for example, to this page. And then if you click on the downloads tab here, it brings up these, and I just started looking at these. And I was like, what is this? And what it turns out is it's a massive amount of data on everybody who's ever been in prison, essentially. Some of this, you can see the file sizes off to the right. The one that I primarily use is this. I'm going to just try to highlight this. Is this one called Inmate Profile, which basically includes demographic data. It includes birth date, race, ethnic group, and sort of when the person is scheduled to get out, when they're eligible for parole. And that's that one you can open that with Microsoft Excel, and it's not too difficult to work with. On the other hand, if you look down here, this database is also really important, sentence component, because that includes much more granular data about what people were sentenced to. And that is the zip file is 235 megabytes. It's like 4.8 million rows, what would be 4.8 million rows of Excel data. So a guy like me who does not have the PhD at the end of his name, this was a little difficult for me to deal with. And I had to, luckily, I live next to like 3 data scientists in a row. And the last guy who I lived next to, or who lived next to me, just helped me write a Python script to open up this sentence component database so that I could mine it for data that I want. So this is just, you guys probably have the skills that I have only begun to explore. And if you want to dig through this, it's really cool. So the next thing that happened was that there was a coalition of folks who began working to raise awareness and to get people out. So the first thing we did was we identified people just from the data that were over 60-year-old who were in for what we would call a nonviolent crime. Although I don't think nonviolent and violent are particularly useful, labels, because, look, I don't want a guy pointing a gun at me, but if I had a choice between someone pointing a gun at me and taking my wallet, or a person repeatedly punching me in the face, it'd be a little bit. If I knew they were just going to point the gun at me and walk away with my wallet, I'd take that over repeatedly punching me in the face. And one of those might be labeled violent and one of them might not, because the punch in the face might be a simple assault that is considered a misdemeanor and therefore not considered a violent crime. We looked at folks who were in medium or minimum and due to be released fairly soon. So what we did was we went to district attorneys and said, hey, can you join us in filing one of these motions for appropriate relief? We've got these people who are older and they're not in for stuff that we think is especially worrisome. And they've done okay. And they've done somewhere between great in prison and pretty well. They're due to get out relatively soon anyway. So why don't we just get them out? Because as you may have heard, there's a global pandemic going on, and there's no reason for them to even be under the threat of death, let alone for them to actually die in prison when we could just get them out. So what we did was, hey, we proposed, let's just modify their sentence a little bit. So for example, if you were convicted of trafficking marijuana, why don't we make it attempted trafficking of marijuana, which will lower your sentence, and they can get out now. And who really cares? He's a weed dealer. No weed dealer needs to die in prison, for Pete's sakes. So the idea is that with the pandemic here, to keep the person in prison would amount to cruel or unusual punishment, which is the way the North Carolina Constitution phrases it. The federal Constitution is cruel and unusual. North Carolina is cruel or unusual. Are those things different? No one knows. Does Ben Finholt think they're different? Yes, I think that North Carolina is broader and allows for more relief, Your Honor, and I think you should absolutely take that into consideration. This might be cruel, but not unusual, but that works because of the word or. We'll see what happens with that. We haven't really gotten a ruling on that one yet. So, as it notes here, somewhat successful in Durham, not really successful anywhere else. The Durham District Attorney is a woman named Satana DeBerry, who ran on a very progressive platform. Many of you may be aware of this. And she is, in fact, progressive. There are people who talk about being progressive and they are not progressive. I have had one sort of run-in with the district attorney in Orange County, where Chapel Hill is, obviously, a guy named Jim Woodall, who is generally put, like, for example, he's on the governor's task force for racial equity. In the personal opinion of Ben Finholt, Jim Woodall is playing at being a progressive, and he says progressive words and he has no idea what that means. Miss DeBerry is a progressive person. She's honestly not as aggressive as I'd like her to be, but she's not here to mess around. She's serious about this. So we reached out to her in Durham, and then Wake County, Pitt County, New Hanover, all of these different places. We reached out to the district attorneys and said, hey, you don't need these drug dealers dying in prison. That would be a terrible thing, right? So why don't we do something about this? And this is what happened. We got 16 people out early on in Durham. In Wake, 1. The guy was 72 years old and in for possession of drugs, and he was at Noose during that massive outbreak. That was the only person they would agree to. Pitt, there have been 2. New Hanover, 1. We had an agreement to get a second person out, but the judge there turned it down. Mecklenburg, 1. Guilford, 0. Buncombe, 1. So by and large, these district attorneys just were not willing to take the problem seriously. And it was a pretty large effort to do this. And so it was really disappointing to see that they just didn't take it as seriously as they should have. So the next thing is that a group of people filed a lawsuit, the NAACP, the ACLU, a group called Emancipate, a group called Forward Justice, Disability Rights North Carolina. All these groups joined together and filed a lawsuit against Governor Cooper, against Eric Hooks, who's the head of the Department of Public Safety, who runs the prisons, and against the Parole Commission. And basically what ended up happening was that the Judge Roger, who was overseeing this, said, hey, DPS, you gotta limit the number of people you're moving around because of this pandemic. And they ignored him because they like to do what they want. So what I did was I just looked at that, what they call the inmate profile data. And in that data, it lists what is called your last movement. So I was able just to download the data and fill out an affidavit saying to the judge, hey, you told them to limit transfers. Last month, they transferred 400 people, despite the fact that you asked them to limit it. And so eventually, what the judge did was said, listen, this has got to stop. You're transferring way too many people. You either need to test them before you transfer them, or you have to quarantine everybody. Once they reach the new place, they have to be quarantined for 14 days. We're not just going to be transferring people around and crossing our fingers. Then the next thing we looked at was this ELC, again, this extended limits of confinement, where they have the authority to say you're going to finish your sentence essentially on probation rather than in the prison. And it's been an absolute and total failure so far. So far they have released 982 people. and this is where we all get to do a little math because we all like math so much. There are 54 prisons in North Carolina, and there are 982 people that have been released from them in 10 months. If anybody wants to shoot me a like average people per prison per month, never mind, don't do it. It's like 1.8. I mean, it's really low. It's basically a meaningless thing. So yes, there have been 982 people who have gotten out earlier than they would have. And that's nice for those people. But in terms of a systemic response, it's basically useless. And this has taken an enormous amount of time and energy for the prison system to review all these people, because here are the criteria that they set up. So you can see here, there's all these really specific ways to qualify for this. And then here are the things that disqualify you. And there are a ton of those. So like if you're on an immigration detainer, they're not going to let you out. If you have an A or B infraction, by the way, disobeying an order in prison is a B level infraction. So if somebody said like, hey, get up against the wall, and you're like, come on, man, stop hassling me, bang, that could get you an infraction that means that you can't get out of prison during a global pandemic. So because of all these rules and regulations, again, this program has been a failure. And I want to talk briefly about infractions again, because infractions affect every part of prison life. It's sort of how soon you can get out of prison, where you can live in prison, whether or not you can work, whether or not you get a home pass. All of this stuff depends on this. And as I noted, if you have an A or B infraction in the last 6 months, you can't qualify for ELC. So getting infractions is really important. And I'm going to blow your mind here. They're racist. Just kidding. That's not going to blow your mind. If you look, what's interesting here is that there's a very neat black-white split. So Black and African-American folks get infractions about 13.2% more often than they should, and white folks get it 11.3% less than they should. Essentially, there are a bunch of infractions going to Black and African-American folks that should go to white people. So this all sets up for a system that is just racist in the way it's considering whether or not people will or won't be able to get out of the way of a global pandemic. So what has happened recently is that the Judge Rozier, who's overseeing that lawsuit filed by the NAACP and ACLU, appointed a guy named Tom Maher, former executive director of the Wilson Center and former director of Indigent Defense Services, to serve as a court liaison. So what I tried to do is to work with Tom and to say, look, they're not doing a good job with the CLC program. So why don't we broaden the categories? And here's what it would look like. The other group that I've worked with is the ACLU, which has a national redemption project going on, where they're trying to get governors to get people out of prison using their clemency powers. So clemency is where a governor can basically just say, you, sir, Will Crozier IV, PhD, I think you've done enough. Let that guy out. The governor can do that at any point, at any time, whenever he wants. So in total, we recommended about 8,500 people for release. And it's the same groups to both of these programs, basically. We're saying, look, these are the folks that we think can be let out. And one easy way would just be to broaden the categories of ELC for this ELC program. Don't make it so nitpicky in terms of what qualifies you and what doesn't. You could get about 7,700 people out that way. And again, this is just looking at the data from that page, downloading that inmate profile data every week, updating who's in, what they're in, and looking at what they're in for, and making these determinations. The other thing was looking at people who are serving life without parole and looking at their sort of incarceration records that are publicly available and saying, look, Governor Cooper, there are 117 of these people who they're serving life without parole for bad crimes, but they have shown great rehabilitation. And because we're in the middle of a global pandemic, maybe it would be time to let these folks out. And then finally, 700 folks who we think could get paroled. So the last thing I'll just very briefly say is parole in North Carolina is generally a joke. What you think of is there's this picture, there's Shawshank Redemption, Morgan Freeman sitting across from a guy saying, I don't know what rehabilitated is. But the fact of the matter is that none of that happens. These are some things from the Parole Commission website itself. They don't meet in a group to discuss cases. They just look at their computers. They don't meet face-to-face with the offender like it's Morgan Freeman. They don't talk to the person at all. So a parole summary is just 8 pages that looks like this, and that's all they're going on when they make parole decisions. And they are casting 91 votes on both parole and this thing called post-release supervision a day. So if you work for 9 hours and 6 minutes in a day and you got to make 91 decisions, that's a decision every 6 minutes. That's not a very serious parole system. So we have filed some lawsuits about this for a guy named Hayden, who when he was 15, we won that one, and people now do get a face-to-face with the commissioners. We tried this for a guy named Alexander, but what they did was instead of dealing with it, they just released him before we could finish the litigation. We were in the process of doing depositions, and they said, we don't want to do this anymore. So that's, I know I've just blitzed through a lot there, but that's sort of where we are with that stuff. This is my contact information if you have questions. And, I think that when you think about sort of what's happened here during the pandemic, I just want, to think about both the fact that folks in prison can't get out of the way, and the fact that, again, as with all things, it's Black and brown folks that are getting hit the hardest with this, because those are the folks that are in prison, and those are the folks who are always most affected by the systemic racism and the white supremacy built into the system. So thanks.
Thanks a million, Ben. That was fantastic. We should split off into our team meetings and work groups, but if folks want to stick around and ask you questions, that'd be great. Or otherwise,
Yep.
We all know how to reach you, and we could
stay
in touch that way too.
Yes, thank you all.